Which is the birthday of the Rebbe Rashab, and our topic is special days, so we're on time. We'll talk about the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab lost his father before he turned 22. The Rebbe Rash passed away in Tishrei. The Rebbe Rashab's birthday is Yoshvim. It's exactly 5 weeks, and the Rebbe Rashab turned 22. The Rebbe Rashab, the first year after his father passed away, he locked himself in his father's room, literally lived in his father's room, and I think he even slept there. He didn't come out. The Frierdiker was a very little boy. The Frierdiker was 2 when his grandfather passed away. And he remembers how the Chassid Reb Hendel would open up the door, the Chassidim would come into the room of the Rebbe Marash, where the Rebbe Rashab was basically living. They would daven. As soon as davening was over, the Rebbe Hendel would usher everybody out, leave the Rebbe Rashab in the room and close the door. The Rebbe Rashab lived in his father's cheder for a year. And I'm sure you all know the famous story that happened to the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, I loved my grandfather's office. The Rebbe Marash was a Rebbe with a lot of money, kvayochel. So he had beautiful, beautiful furniture. His office was very large, had very nice furniture. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, I love to go into my Zayda's room and sit down on those very comfortable chairs and daydream. I had my imagination worked very well in the Rebbe Marash's office. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, one time I was sitting on one of these chairs and I look up and I see across the room is my father, next to his father's desk, the Rebbe Marash's desk. And my father's wearing Big Day Shabbos, wearing his streimel, his zayd and a kapota and a gartel. And he's holding a paper, and he's whispering, the Rebbe Rashab is, and he's crying terribly. He's very, very upset, very emotional. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I was so filled with fear. I was frozen. I was frozen with fear. I couldn't move. And I started to cry. I started to wail, to cry hysterically. My mother, the Rebbe Sishtan, heard me crying, and she ran in and she pulled me out. When you read that story, the impression that you get, Frierdiker Rebbe was very little. That the Frierdiker Rebbe saw something that most people don't see. What was he so upset about? His father was standing in front of an empty desk. The Rebbe Marash was after the Istalkus. Why was he so? What frightened the Frierdiker Rebbe so much? I believe that at that very, very young age, the Frierdiker Rebbe saw something that most people don't see. But that's what frightened him. After that first year, the Rebbe Rashab stopped living in his father's room, but he spent 10 whole years, agonizing over the responsibility of being a Rebbe. That's the impression that you get. You know, you have so many contradictions. In some places it says, the moment one sun sets, the second sun rises. So at the moment of the stalkus of the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab becomes the Rebbe Yossi. That's one perspective. Then you also have what the Rebbe said, our Rebbe said. Our Rebbe said that the siman of Messias is Amiras Dach. That a Rebbe becomes a Rebbe after his father's passing by saying Chassidus. So the Rebbe Marash passed away Yud Gimel Tishrei, which was Erev Sukkos, Mamish Erev Sukkos. The Rebbe Rashab's first maimer as a Rebbe was said, Shabbos Chel HaMeyet Sukkos, less than a week after his father passed away, the Rebbe Rashab already said Chassidus. We don't have that maimer. The first maimer we have from the Rebbe Rashab is from Pashas Noach, which is 3 weeks after his father passed. But the Rebbe Nishma said Chassidus within days of his father's petir, his father's histalkus. But then you also have sort of the more official position. The Rebbe Rashab did not officially become a Rebbe until 10 years after the year of Avelis. In other words, it's a full 11 years minus a few days. The first year, Tov Reish Mem Gimel, the year of Avelis, the Rebbe Rashab was completely isolated. He pushed lived in his father's cheder. The next 10 years, the Rebbe Rashab agonized over becoming a Rebbe. During that 10 years, the Rebbe Rashab traveled a lot.
The first 10 years?
During those 10 years, the Rebbe Rashab was sick a lot. Twice during that decade. He almost lost his life. Kipshut almost passed away. And it's very clear, to me at least, that the Rebbe Rashab's illnesses, physical illnesses, to to the point of ksisa. He was almost, mamish was on a banana peel. Was from distress, from the burden of knowing that he's a Rebbe. His father, the Rebbe Marash, told him before his bar mitzvah that he was going to be a Rebbe. And the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe the story, and he said that when my father told it to me, a pain shot up my back, from his lower back to the shoulder. And that pain he suffered with till the day he passed away. It never left him. The stress, the responsibility of being a Rebbe, he caused him Rebbe Gesund Pashat. It made the Rebbe sick. The end of the story is that Rosh Hashanah Tafresh and Dalet, 1893 to 94, Rosh Hashanah, which was 11 years minus 13 days. After his father passed, the Rebbe Rashab walked into the shul and he sat down in his father's place. He Pashat took his father's seat, and then it was official. It was Rebbe and the Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab was the Rebbe. So some Chassidim went to other places. People went to Kapust. Maybe some went to Pelish Rebbe's. But some stuck around. I mean, Lubavitch, B'chlal, whenever, if it's real, whenever a Rebbe becomes Rebbe, he rebuilds. Even the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Ben Yochid, rebuilt. Our Rebbe, well, he rebuilt. Yeah, he also rebuilt it. He didn't rebuild. He built a whole new building, you know. But each Rebbe, there's such an experience. Some of the Chassidim left, some of the Chassidim stayed. The previous Rebbe describes the elder Chassidim feeling empathetic. They couldn't help the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was in his 20s. They were in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But they all understood that this is a young Rebbe and they're old Chassidim, you know. A young animal doesn't become a mensch because he's old. So they felt his pain and they supported him without supporting him. They couldn't help him. But as much as they could, they were very sensitive to Lubavitch. That's what they did. They were very sensitive to Lubavitch. They were very careful to do whatever the Rebbe wanted to make it easier. But Hashanah Tov Reish Nadal, he walked into the Beis Medrash. He sat down in his father's place and it became official. He was a Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab became a Rebbe.
11 years later?
Yeah, 11 years minus 2 weeks. During that period of time, there were tkufas, periods. Sometimes the Rebbe Rashab said Maimorim, sometimes the Rebbe Rashab didn't say Maimorim. Sometimes the Rebbe Rashab had Yechidus, sometimes the Rebbe Rashab didn't have Yechidus. There was also this phenomena that he would see men and he wouldn't see women. I mean, B'chlal, the way our Rebbe related to women is very, very unusual. Very unusual. The Rebbe treated men and women equal. But the earlier Rabbeim, they were different. Tkufas, different Rabbeim, different Tkufas. But there were periods that the Rebbe Rashab wouldn't see women. So if you were a woman and you needed a Rebbe, you went to his wife or to his mother. And they would give you access, however they did it. Then he became a Rebbe. Tafresh became a Rebbe.
What year were you Yeshiva?
It's Rosh Hashanah Reish Dal, 1893 to 1894. You know, the Goyish dates and the Hebrew dates are off by a few months. Tafresh Dal, Rosh Hashanah. When the Rebbe Rashab became a Rebbe, it's hard to understand exactly what he was busy with. Obviously, he said Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab always said Chassidus. His life was Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab used to say that he was a young man, he never went to Fabrengens because he was so busy with the Haskol and Avoid of Chassidus, he had no time for what he called Vasarum Chassidus is, what's going on around Chassidus. And as was the old Lubavitcher tradition, there was such a thing called the Yoshvim. You must understand how Chassidus B'chlal, how Chassidus looked in Europe, all over Europe, and especially in Russia. Chassidim did not have yeshivas. And I guess you wouldn't even say Misnagdim did have yeshivas. There were yeshivas. The yeshivas were led by Gedolei Yisrael, by big Go'onim. I would say that in Russia, most of them were Misnagdim, not Chassidim, Litvisha. But a yeshiva in those days didn't have a bias. If you went to learn in a yeshiva of the great Litvisha Gedolim, Reistach, in what's the most famous yeshiva of all? Volozhin, right? Volozhin is the father of all the yeshivas. And then you have Brisk, and you have Slobodka, and you have Mir, and you have Baranovich, and you have Radin, the famous Litvish yeshivas. They taught you Torah. That was it. Lumdus. And they taught you a lot of Torah. To get into those yeshivas, you had to be a genius. A lot of the Bachrim, these yeshivas were Chassidish Bachrim. Some of the Bachrim were not Chassidish Bachrim, Eilamish Bachrim. If you had an interest in Avodah and how to serve Hashem, you would leave the yeshiva for Yom Tov, let's say, and you would go to your Rebbe. It was a very common thing for for the Bachrim, for these various yeshivas, when it came Yom Tov, each one went to his Rebbe, and some of them used to take along their Chavedim, who were not Chassidim, they wanted to see what happens by a Chassidish Rebbe on Yom Tov. So Lubavitch didn't have yeshivas either. The Tzemach Tzedek for a shtickle Zeit had yeshivas, Lubavitch didn't have yeshivas, and I don't think Koppos had yeshivas either. So the Seder was Azoy. I mean, the average boy, by the time he was 14, was working. By the time he was 16 or 17, he was married, understand? The average boy went to Cheder. In Cheder, he had one malamed who taught him Dardik. He had to read Ivre, had to read Hebrew, and Siddur, and maybe he taught him a little Chumash. And you stayed by the Dardiki malamed as long as you needed to. If you were very bright, you stayed with Dardiki malamed 3 months. If you were very dense, you spent with Dardiki malamed 3 years. You didn't leave the malamed because you graduated. You stayed until you learned to read properly, and whatever it was that you learned with that, and then you went to the next malamed. And the next malamed taught you Mishnah and Haschalas Gemara, and you stayed by that malamed. Again, it wasn't biological, it wasn't chronological. You stayed as long as you needed to, and then you went to the next malamed. The next one taught you Gemara. The third one taught you Gemara, maybe even Gemara with Mefarshim. So the average boy in the shtetl, and the people of the shtetl for the most part were simple people. They were not very learned, and their children were also average or below. They went to Cheder, they learned Siddur, they learned Chumash, they learned Halacha, they learned Mishnah, maybe some of them learned a little Gemara. By the time you became Bar Mitzvah, the average yeshiva boy's life was over. That was it. You have to understand, in the shtetl, the sewers were purer than our shuls. The shtetl was such a pure environment. They lived with goyim, but there was no newspaper, there was no radio, there was no plumbing. It's very simple. So it was very, very pure. So you were literally raised by the streets. So the average boy was done with yeshiva at 12, 13. If you were bright, very bright, every city had a Rav. And the Rav in the city was doubled as the Rosh Yeshiva. If you were very smart, when you finished Cheder, you would sit down in the Beis Medrash by yourself and learn Gemara. And the Rav was responsible for you. It means he would come into the Beis Medrash and talk to you in learning. And the Rabbanim knew the whole Shas, even in a small shtetl. And he would give you direction, he would help you learn. If the Rav felt that you were exceptional, he would write you a letter of recommendation to the yeshiva he had gone to. And you came from a shtetl, and you learned in Cheder, let's say, till 12. Then you sat by your Rav in Beis Medrash, either by yourself, if you had no chavrusa. If there were 2 of you, you sat with the chavrusa, and you would learn a whole day by yourself. The Rav would give you a shir, the Rav would give you direction. And after a year or 2, the Rav would say, you know what, I'm writing you a letter. I want you to go to my Rosh Yeshiva, take this letter, maybe he'll accept you. And twice a year, the Bachrim would go to the big yeshivas. It was called Azman. Tishrei time and Nisan time. And 200 or 300 Bachrim showed up for each Zman. 200 or 300 Bachrim would show up Pesach time and Tishrei time to the famous yeshivas in Eastern Europe, in Russia, which were the best yeshivas in the world. And they would be tested. On average, it took 20 or 30, which meant the chances of you were the Eli of your city, right? You were the smartest guy in town. And the Rav took a risk, he wrote a letter of recommendation because he felt that amongst the boys who could learn you from the God Gehoibene, he would write you a letter of recommendation to his Rosh Yeshiva. And the chances of his taking you were probably 1 in 10, 1 in 12. The odds were very stacked against you. So the yeshivas were elite. The yeshivas in Russia were incredible. I mean, the average, intelligence of a bacha and a yeshiva in Russia in those days was, by today's standard, genius. They were very, very smart. And a lot of the boys who got into these yeshivas were Chassidish Bachrim. The Chassidim were not afraid. I send my kid to a non-Lubavitcher yeshiva, he'll come a misnagid. It was parv. It wasn't like today where the Litvish yeshivas want to make you into a misnagid, have their own derech. It was very, very different. And a lot of Lubavitchers learned in these yeshivas, as did whatever other Russian Chassidus you had. Koidenov, you had different Chassidus in Russia. Lubavitch was the biggest, Chabad was the biggest, but they weren't the only ones. So a Chassidish Bacher, or a Chassidish younger man, who either learned in one of the yeshivas in Russia, or he learned by his father, when he reached an age of maturity, which was usually either when he was in his early 20s, or even after his chasana, would move to Lubavitch. If he was married, he moved without his wife. Our Rebbe said about his grandfather, his mother's father, that he doesn't understand how it was done. But right after Sheva Brachas, they were married a week. His grandfather, the Meir Shleima, left his wife and went to Lubavitch and stayed for 6 months. I can't understand how, but that was the Seder. And when you came to Lubavitch, you were called a Yoshiv. Literally means a sitter. You sat. There was nobody policing you. If you wanted to waste your time, you wasted your time. These were the best boys. They were the brightest. And they had been learning in the big yeshivas in Russia from before. They would take off 6 months of their yeshiva learning, or a year of their yeshiva learning, and they'd move to Lubavitch. And B'chlal, you must understand, in general, if you lived in Russia and you went to yeshiva, there was no dormitory, there was no kitchen, there was no nothing. You came to a yeshiva, and the yeshiva provided you a place to sit and learn, and a yeshiva to give you a shir, and that was it. You came with your own money, you made your own accommodations, you would rent a room or a part of a room, and you would buy meals. A lot of Bachrim were very poor, and they lived in very, very small budgets. They were meis nefesh. There was no structure like today where you come to school and you pay tuition. The yeshivas didn't charge tuition. You showed up at the yeshiva. If they took you for free, which happens to be the halacha. You're not allowed to charge tuition for teaching Torah. And you were on your own. You paid your own way. So if you came to Lubavitch and you wasted your time, you wasted your money, because Lubavitch didn't provide you any provisions. So Lubavitch Chassidim, kids that came from Lubavitch homes, who were very bright, who had been learning in these yeshivas, or even if they were not learning yeshivas, they were learning with their father, the Rav, at home. When they reach an age of maturity, girls, the word maturity is a part of this sentence. We don't often hear it because you don't know what it means. But you reach an age of maturity, when you were considered a badas, that means 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, you would leave the place where you were sitting and studying, and you would move to Lubavitch, and you would become what was called a Yoshiv. Yoshiv means a zitzer, a sitter. What do you do in Lubavitch? You learned Chassidus a whole day and all night. You came to learn the derech of Chabad. I mean, you girls know that the derech of Chabad is not just a philosophy, it's not just books. It's an avodah. It's a whole approach to serving the Eibishter. And of course, especially in those days, much more than today, avodah meant avodah satfila, davening. And it meant his bonus, learning how to contemplate, learning how to think, learning how to focus, learning how to tune into your neshama, and so on. So Lubavitch always had young men around, always. I'm talking at the times, the Tzemach Tzedek was a gigantic Rebbe, so there was always people around. But the Rebbe Marash was a relatively small Rebbe in terms of population. There were always young Galite, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, sometimes 30. Nobody kicked you out and nobody invited you. You came on your own with your own dime. You had to bring your own money because nobody supported you. You rented a room. The peasants in Lubavitch made a living. That's how they lived. They lived on the people came to visit Lubavitch, had a room and board. They didn't make a lot of money, but they made a little money. They gave them food, they gave them a bed. And that's how people lived in Lubavitch. These Yoshvim would come and they would sit in Lubavitch for 6 months or for a year, if they could really, really afford it, or they were really, really deep, they stayed for 2 years. And during the time that they sat in Lubavitch, they were involved in Chassidus. In Yeshiva, they learned Lamdas, they learned Gemara and Halach, Nigle. They would take an interruption from that period, that learning, come to Lubavitch for a certain period of time, and they would dedicate the period of time they were in Lubavitch, first of all, to learning Chassidus, to verstehen, to understand. And then, when they graduated from that, so to speak, they would use the time they were in Lubavitch to engage in learning Darkei HaAvodah. And a lot of young Galite, who would later become big Rabbonim, right? An example, the Rebbe's father, the Blavik, the Rebbe's grandfather, both grandfathers, the Baruch Shneir and the Rebbe Meir Shleimer, they both came to Lubavitch as young Galite, and they sat by the Rebbe Marash for a period of time, 6 months, a year and a half, 2, and they first learned Chassidus, and then they learned Darkei HaAvodah, and these famous Rabbonim that you hear about in Russia, who were big Rabbonim, who davened all day long, they learned that in Lubavitch. They didn't learn it in a yeshiva, they learned it by spending some time away from their families and from the yeshivas and from their regular activities, learning Chassidus and Darkei HaAvodah. So there was always Yoshvim in Lubavitch. Now, the Rabbeim said Chassidus. The Rebbe Marash said Chassidus often. The Rebbe Rashab, if he was healthy, said Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab was sick a lot. There's a sikha from the Rebbe Fidi who he writes that Tov Reish Nun Hey is given wenig Chassidus, but when Afreilich a Yor. Tov The moods were different. The Rebbe Rashab said Chassidus when he was able to. Sometimes he couldn't for all kinds of reasons, including Poshet health. Who did he talk to? Who did Rebbe Rashab talk to when he said Chassidus? There was nobody in Lubavitch. Lubavitch was a tiny village of farmers, of prosta mention, subsistence farmers. That means people literally lived from the land. They had a cow, they had a goat, they had a chicken. That's how they lived. They were not shaykhs and Chassidus, they knew how to read Hebrew. Who was the Rebbe talking to? The answer was he talked to the guests. Greise Chassidim von Kummen, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But there were not always that many guests. He talked to the Yoshvim, the Rabbeim said Chassidus to the younger light, let's say early mid-20s, who stopped their lives for a period of time, 6 months or a year or two, and during that period of time they were singularly dedicated to learning Chassidus. You have to understand that these Chevre, by the time they came to Lubavitch, in Nigla they were very proficient. They were big lomdim. In other words, it wasn't kinderlach like today, kids coming to learn Chassidus. When you showed up on Lubavitch to begin learning Chassidus and Darkei Avoda, you already had learned in one of the best yeshivas in Russia, or from your father who was himself a big Rav and a big God. So you came to Lubavitch to learn Chassidus with an enormous background in Torah and Yiras Shamayim, because you wanted to be Mishtah, you wanted to have the yin of Chassidus, Limud Chassidus and Darkei Avoda. And that's whom the Rabbeim, when I say the Rabbeim, I mean in the narrow sense of the word, the Rebbe Marash and then the Rebbe Rashab. In the early years, that's who they said the Chassidus to. And these younger lights, these Yoshvim as they were called, these Zitzers, they were totally on their own. Nobody gave them a penny. They lived on their own dollar. They would the Rebbe said Chassidus. They would chazed the Maimorim, they would review it. They were very bright. And this was their life, the Torah that they heard in Lubavitch. And they would write Hanochas, they'd write transcripts of the Hanochas. If they were not clear, they would go into the Rebbe and ask the Rebbe to explain the Maimah to them. And the Rebbe would help them. And usually later on in the week, the Rebbe Rashab would give out the Maimah himself. The Rebbe Rash, first they wrote their own transcripts, their own Hanochas. And then a few days later, the Rebbe would give them the Maimah in his own Nusach, the way he wrote it. And different Rabbeim and different Minhagim. Mashal, the Rebbe Marash, when he spoke a Maimah and when he wrote a Maimah, sometimes they were so different, you don't even recognize it. By the Rebbe Rashab and the Friedrich Rebbe, when he spoke a Maimah and he wrote a Maimah, it was word for word. It was exactly the same. Mamish. Okay, and their life was the Chassidus. By the Rebbe Marash, for example, the minig was, till Tuesday, you could come in and ask any question. So the Rabbeim were basically the mashpiyim of these guys. The Rebbe wasn't available to these people 24 hours a day. There were elder Chassidim in Lubavitch who would also be mashpiyah and madech the Bachrim. But the Rebbe was very involved with these younger light. The Rebbe was very involved with these chevra. They came to Lubavitch. And they would learn Chassidus and Darkei Chassidus and Darkei Avoda by visiting Lubavitch from the Rebbe and from the elder Chassidim were there. It was a whole culture. It was a beautiful, beautiful culture. Then these younger light went back to their yeshivas, went back to their homes, and eventually they became the big Chassidish Rabbanim in Russia. This was sort of the trajectory. You learned Torah, and when you grew up, you became a mature man, you would start learning Chassidus and Darkei Avoda, and you would binge. You would spend 6 months where you did it day and night. This became your life. And this was the foundation of their Chassidish life, their Derech Avoda in Chabad, what we call now Pnimius. During that period of time that they spent in Lubavitch, they would take Hedracha and Hera and Limud for their whole lives. So the Rebbe Rashab was involved with these Yoshvim as well. During that 10 and 11 year period where the Rebbe Rashab was personally struggling, I don't know how much time he gave them. But the Rebbe Rayatz writes the names of the men who lived in Lubavitch and the Hanochas that they wrote. They wrote the transcripts, they wrote the Maimorim down. So what was the Rebbe Rashab doing when he became a Rebbe officially? It's hard to say, but you have to assume that he began to get involved more with the Yoshvim. He got more involved with them. He taught them more, he inspired them more, gave them more direction. The Rebbe Rashab was acting as the Chabad Rebbe. It's hard for us to even understand what that means today because our mindset has been so changed. A Chabad Rebbe teaches Chassidus. A Chabad Rebbe is busy with Chassidus and with Avodah. That's what they did. The Rabbeim used to say the only reason for Yechidus, for Avodas Hashem, Yechidus wasn't made to go into the Rebbe with your problems. Your job, your health, your parnasa, it was not Yechidus. Yechidus was for the Alter Rebbe made Yechidus for Avodah. So that's what the Chabad Rebbeim did. Again, you think about Lubavitch today, it's hard even to imagine this. But that was the tradition. Again, I'm using the Reb Marash and the Rebbe Rashab as a model, because the Tzemach Tzedek was l'chayre bigger, was gigantic, the Reb Marash, Tzemach Tzedek. But also it was the same thing. The average Lubavitcher Chassid, I used to ask my grandfather, who passed away when I was 10 and a half, if his family was Lubavitch. He said, yeah. How far back? Till the Alter Rebbe. So I asked my grandfather, how often did your father go to Lubavitch? And my grandfather told me he never went to Lubavitch. I said, what kind of chassid is Mordechai Rebbe? And there was no way my grandfather could explain to me what a shtetl meant and what shtetl life was before the train, when you went by wagon. The only people who came to Lubavitch were real chassidim. That means that the Rabbeim could teach them Darkei Havodah. The average chassid, David Nusachari, sat by the chassidus on Friday night and sat by the Maimer Shabbos afternoon. The Chabad really was a very exclusive chassidus. The Rabbeim were busy with deeper people. The average person had nothing to do in Lubavitch. There was nothing to entertain you. If you understood a Maimer and you needed Yoni Avodah, you came to Lubavitch. Otherwise, Lubavitch was boring, as they say today. And the Rabbeim were dedicated to these Jungelai, teaching them Darkei Avodah, Darkei Chassidus, and it wasn't a lot of people. It was not a lot of people, relatively speaking. But these people would become the Rabbonim all over Russia, and the Mashpiyim all over Russia, and the Shachtim all over Russia, and the Melamdim all over Russia. So they brought the spirit of Chassidus for Lubavitch to the people that they were around. But it really was exclusive. Chabad Chassidus was not, today everybody's running to the Rebbe. It was for people who were shaykhs to a deep understanding, which is hard enough in itself. But specifically people who were shaykhs to a deep understanding, they could translate into Avodas HaTefillah, into davening. So Lubavitch did not have a lot of people around, but there were always people around. There were always people around. Not a lot, but some. Now we now know from the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the Rebbe, our Rebbe's journal. Our Rebbe kept a journal, as you know, called the Yeshimis now, it's published, which is basically the things that the previous Rebbe told him. And the previous Rebbe told the Rebbe something which was not known till after Gimel Tammuz. And the idea of making Tomchei Temimim was not the Rebbe Rashab's idea, it was the Frierdiker Rebbe's idea. The Rebbe Rashab did not want to make Tomchei Temimim, the Rebbe Rashab was very weary of it. The Rebbe Rashab said all over Russia there's big yeshivas, there's no shortage of yeshivas. People are learning Torah in the best yeshivas in the world were the Litvish yeshivas, which were all in Russia. And if Chassidish young man who was shaykhs to Lamdis, if he didn't learn from his father, went to one of the yeshivas, and they were not afraid he was going to become a misnagid. There wasn't that kind of world. So you need a Chassidish yeshiva, and the Rebbe Rayat said, we need a yeshiva. And the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, the way you get the impression is they argued about it. Now here's what's interesting. The Rebbe Rashab was how old when this happened? Frierdiker Rebbe was how old when this happened? 15, 16, he was a young boy. At the age of 15, on his 15th birthday, the Rebbe Rashab made the previous Rebbe his private secretary, and he took him into all matters of public service, and he spoke to him about Mesiras Nefesh. Frierdiker Rebbe Bechlal, I mean, when you read about his life, it gets you upset. He never had a life. As a child, he didn't have a father, and by the time he was mamish in his early adolescence, the Rebbe Rashab gave him away to the Jewish people. Frierdiker Rebbe was never a child. I mean, he tries to describe himself as a regular kid, but there was nothing regular about him.
What do you mean he never father?
His father was sick. So the Frierdiker Rebbe argued with his father making the yeshiva. He argued with him about it. As they cooked ice, and the Rebbe hesitated. The Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe, "Was misnagdish shtik a yeshiva? Misnagde make yeshivas. We're making a yeshiva," and the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted it. When you read these rishimis, you almost feel, and again, this is me talking now from my own hergeshim, you almost feel like the Frierdiker Rebbe knew what he was in for. Because Tomchei Temimim was the Rebbe Rashab's yeshiva. The Tomchei Temimim was the Frierdiker Rebbe's army. And the Frierdiker Rebbe's army needed to be tough as steel, because they lived through one of the worst periods in the history of the world, and certainly one of the worst periods in the history of the Jewish people. The Frierdiker Rebbe, as a teenager, as a young boy, told his father to machne yeshiva, and the Rebbe didn't want. And they teetered back and forth. The end of the story is that it was basically, and again, I'm dramatizing and exaggerating just a bit, it was a wedding gift. The Frierdiker Rebbe got his father to acquiesce for the chasana. The expression of the Yeshiva is, the Yeshiva is from the Zachen, was ich auf ausgepeilt auf Chasene. The Yeshiva is one of those things that I got from my father when I got married. And the Yeshiva was Nisyasid in the middle of the Sheva Brachas. The Friedrich Rebbe got married on Friday. On Sunday, Tezvav Elul, the Rebbe Rashab talked, made a meeting and discussed it with the Balabatim and the Chassidim. And the Yeshiva officially opened its doors on Chai Elul Wednesday. Now where do you get Bachrim from? You get Bachrim in a week. And the answer is there was always Bachrim. They were the Yoshvim. They just took the boys who were there unofficial and officially made yeshivas. So now they had to feed them and clothe them of our dormitory. Until then, the Bachrim paid their own way. They took the Chevre who were in Tomchei Temimim on their own. They were in Lubavitch on their own. They came to be Yoshvim. And we know some of the names of these people. And the Rebbe took whoever was in Lubavitch at that time, and he, so to speak, as they say in American, he incorporated the yeshiva, he made Tomchei Temimim, and those Yoshvim who were all in their 20s, they were not little kids, were the seeds, they were the first Talmidim of yeshivas Tomchei Temimim that the Rebbe Rashab was beyasid, and the Friedrich Rebbe encouraged him to be beyasid. Now what's interesting about it is that when you read the Sichos, in other words, before Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe Rashab said, I spent 10 years going to the oil and making a yeshiva. It's hard to understand. What do you mean you spent 10 years making a yeshiva? You didn't want it. The Friedrich Rebbe wanted it. Looks like this argument had been going on for some time. And the Rebbe Rashab finally acquiesced. He gave in to his son, he made a yeshiva, and he told the Friedrich Rebbe, quote, "Zos wissen mit dem sich, understand the responsibility you're taking. You're making a yeshiva. It's a big achrayas." And so to speak, as they say in the real world, Tomchei Temimim opened his doors with 10 bachrim. I'm going to finish now with you, and I'm going to continue with the next group. If you want to hear the rest of it, ask me, I'll send it to you. But I just want to say this to you, that there was a chassid in our generation who was a very, very special chassid. His name was Reb Zusha Vilamovsky, the partisan. And Zusha Vilamovsky was a real interesting man. You start a yeshiva on Sunday, and you start learning on Wednesday. What do you do for 3 days? The yeshiva was Misyasid, Sunday, Tezvav Elul. The yeshiva was Chaya, what's the pshat? They opened the kitchen, so for the first 3 days, they verbringt. They started to learn Wednesday Chayel, but until then it was a verbringen. Okay, I'll see you when I see you.
Thank you.